behind. Hi, good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Dion Fulmer, the World Bank's Director for the Research Department here at the bank. Welcome to this policy research talk. This is going to be, I think, the second one since our summer break. As some of you may know, these talks provide us an opportunity to present work that's coming out of the research department with the goal of sharing the findings with colleagues inside and outside the department, along with others, increasingly so outside of the World Bank. Welcome both to our audience on WebEx as well as on YouTube today. Today, my colleague Forhad Shilpi, who is a senior economist in the sustainability and infrastructure team in the department, will be presenting. She's in the sustainability and infrastructure team, but at the same time, she has a substantial research portfolio on the intergenerational education inequality with a focus on gender. And she's going to be presenting insights from that work today. As you may have noticed, our original discussant was unable to join us due to a last-minute conflict. Apologize for that. I am, however, extremely pleased to welcome Halsey Rogers today to serve as discussant. Halsey is a lead economist with the World Bank's Education Global Practice, and he served as co-director of the World Development Report 2018, Learning to Realize Education's Promise. He currently leads the Global Education Policy Dashboard Initiative, and he recently co-authored a report entitled The COVID-19 Pandemic Shocks to Education and Policy Responses, as well as Realizing the Future of Learning. And he's also a co-creator of the World Bank's Learning Poverty Indicator. Just to give you a little bit of background, in the past, Halsey represented the bank in the SDG negotiations on education, has led the bank's global teacher policy research effort. He also co-authored the bank's Education Strategy 2020, Learning for All. He's widely published in peer-reviewed journals and has advised governments in every region of the world. Generally, he works on the quality of service delivery in education, teacher effectiveness, outcome and process metrics, families' education investments, aid effectiveness, and development strategy, among other topics. Prior to joining the bank, Halsey served with the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. He was at UC Berkeley for a time, the Indonesian Ministry of Finance, as well as the Korea Development Institute. So certainly has the credentials to be our discussant today. Look forward to hearing him speak. Just a run of show, I'll ask Forhad to talk for approximately 45 minutes today, after which we'll hear from Halsey for about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll conclude the session with Q&A from the audience. If you have a question, please use the raised hand option in WebEx or send me a chat message that you have a question and I will call on you and ask you to ask the question. If you're following on YouTube, please submit the question in the chat and it'll get relayed to me. I just want to remind everybody, today we are going to be recording the session, so I hope you don't mind that. With that, over to you, Forhad.
Thank you very much, Dion, for the kind introduction. Let me start with sharing my screen. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, good. So today I'm going to talk about the drivers of intergenerational educational mobility in developing countries. And I actually thought that I start with a fun quiz. And the quiz is for all of you. Okay. Where do you think the most expensive single-family home located? Is it in India or is it in USA? I'm going to give you a little hint. Per capita GDP in USA is around $62,000 relative to $6,700 in India. Now, given this, if you guessed it's India, you are actually correct. Here is the most expensive house in the US, which is valued as $250 million. And here is the Ambani house in Mumbai, which is valued at $1 billion. The point that I'm trying to make here is that inequality has risen in developed countries, it has also risen quite a bit in developing countries. And if the rise in inequality is because of inequality of opportunity, so that children's economic outcomes are still determined largely by parents' economic status, then I mean this is a serious concern. Human capital is one of the main mechanisms through which inequality is transmitted across generation. So in this situation, an attractive policy intervention would be to invest in human capital, particularly in education, so we can weaken this association between children and parents' outcome. Now, what is the evidence? A couple of years ago, my colleague Roy van der Weide made a similar talk as today. And one of the key findings from his talk and his work with his co-authors was that intergenerational persistence is actually much higher in developing countries than developed countries. But what he gave was a snapshot at a point in time, so we can't really tell, how the persistent would respond to interventions in education or economic policies. For that evidence, we need to move to developed countries. I should mention in here that the evidence for developed countries are mostly related to income mobility, not so much on educational mobility. But right now, there is this very interesting debate going on. People on one side of this debate are pointing out that among the OECD countries, mobility in income is actually better than mobility in education. And the variance of education mobility is much smaller. And this is despite the fact economic policies and education policies varies quite a bit across these countries. And on the basis of that, they conclude that education maybe is not the great level or that all of us want it to be. And I want to mention a very interesting book here by historian Gregory Clark. He traced children's outcomes over centuries by their surnames. And on the base, and this has done it across a couple of countries. And on the basis of that, he concluded that our fate is more or less determined by the surname that we are born into. People on the other side of debate works actually on the Scandinavian countries, and they do provide some credible evidence that with their generous welfare policies and as well as education investment, these
So Forhad, I think you're freezing. Is that just me, or is that general?
That's
No,
general.
it's general.
Forhad, maybe if you turned off your video, that might help with the audio. Forhad, are you there? So,
Hi, Forhad. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but if your internet connection is unstable, we can have you call in with your phone so that you can continue the presentation that way.
Can't someone call her? I just tried, the phone is busy.
Dion, I will try to get in touch with Forhad right now, separately, and see if I can help reconnect her either through WebEx or on the phone, one way or another.
Sorry, everyone. We did do a test earlier and it all was working fine. It looks like she's trying to reconnect. Need one of those things like they used to do in the olden days on TV, where they would have like a little video or a bird tweeting or something, just to, having technical difficulties, please stand by.
They used to play Beethoven in Bangladesh on TV.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I think electricity went off in my side. And because of that, I think we lost maybe a bit of the presentation. So let me go back to the presentation and share it again.
Sure.
Or do you see my screen?
Right now, we don't see your shared screen, no.
No? Okay, so maybe I need to stop sharing and then share again. Okay, here we go. Now you see my screen, right?
Yep.
Okay, so let me go back. So I think maybe the part that we missed was the outline.
Sure.
Okay, so in terms of outline, I am going to talk about the data constraint, and then I will combine conceptual framework with empirical evidence to answer 3 questions. Everybody estimates one parameter to indicate the intergenerational persistence. The question I'm going to ask is whether this parameter is constant across the distribution of parents' education. This will have interesting policy and implication, actually. Then I am going to tackle the question of whether if we invest in school quality, if that is going to increase or reduce intergenerational persistence, and focusing on Indonesia in this case. And finally, I will also talk about how gender bias gets reflected in the gender differences in educational mobility of boys and girls, and this in the context of India. Okay, with that, let me move on to start with the data constraint. One thing that I'm going to say that, I am going to draw from a couple of my papers, and whenever, I'm drawing evidence from papers, I will put up a slide with the title of the papers and the co-authors. Okay, so this is the paper from which I'm going to draw evidence on the data constraint part. In terms of data, basically I'm going to focus on the truncation bias and what it does to the estimates of intergenerational persistence. The gold standard in data for intergenerational studies are actually the birth registries that are available in the context of Scandinavian countries. The reason being that there you can track every family member, but much of the data comes in developing country comes from household surveys or censuses, which imposes this residency condition. And because of this residency restriction, the samples may miss out parents or children who are out of the households, either migrated for work, study, or something else. Okay. This leads to classic truncation bias. To tell you, what it implies for estimation of intergenerational persistence, I am going to take, in this paper, actually, we take 2 panel surveys, one from India and one from Bangladesh. And these panel surveys collected information about the extended family, so we can actually create the, entire family tree. So here in this slide on the left-hand side, I had plotted the proportion of non-resident kids by kids' education. And the top one is for Bangladesh, bottom one is for India, the solid line is for girls, and the dotted line, dashed line is for boys. And from here, you can see that the co-residency pattern actually varies between boys and girls and across countries. In this case, the 2 countries are neighboring countries. So you do see that they vary quite a bit. And on the right-hand side, what I did is I estimated a linear intergenerational regression equation. The specification is given in the bottom here. And since you're gonna see this regression many times, let me explain a little bit of, what it means. Beta 1 is the slope parameter that measures the, in this literature, it's called relative mobility, but actually it's relative immobility. In other words, bigger values of beta 1s means higher persistence, and it's supposedly bad. Smaller value means weaker correlation between parents and children, and it's supposedly good and shows better mobility. Okay. So what I did here is that I plotted, the predicted values using this regression here. The slope actually tells you the measures of relative mobility. The solid lines are for the full sample, and dotted lines are co-resident sample. Now, if you just look at the dotted lines in both the top and bottom graph, what you can see that they are always flatter. In other words, if you just focus on the co-resident sample, you're gonna underestimate the beta coefficient. So things will look much better. I mean, it would look like there is more mobility when there is not. Okay, so that's one of the things. Some of cases, these biases are quite large. Here on the top graph, the bias is almost about 30%. For girls, it is going to be even bigger, okay? Because, there are co-residency problem is much stricter for girls. And if we do the inter-country comparison, again, in the basis of dotted dashed line, you would kind of conclude that the persistence is similar in Bangladesh and India, but if you look at the solid lines, persistence is actually much higher in Bangladesh. So bottom line here is that when we are doing this estimation and comparing across groups, across countries, even within same country over time, we need to pay attention to this truncation bias. And in fact, I am going to use data from 3 countries throughout this presentation, and I tell you up front that the data set that I am using, none of them are subject to, they are subject to less of this truncation bias because the surveys made an effort to collect information on non-resident family members. Okay, with that, I am going to move on to describing you the conceptual framework on the basis of which I will, provide more empirical evidence. So I already told you, how the regression equation looks like. The objective of policy is to make beta 1, magnitude of beta 1 smaller and magnitude of beta 0, which actually captures the absolute mobility of kids who are born to households with, to parents with no education, to make that parameter larger. To trace, what goes into this parameter, I am going to, develop a conceptual framework in the next slide. And that conceptual framework will borrow quite heavily from this paper by Baker and 3 of his co-authors. We will actually rely a lot more on the 2015 version of the paper. Okay, let's try and see, what determines this, what goes behind this association between parents and children's education. Okay, on the left-hand side, we have parents' education, and parent can have can affect children's education through 2 channels: non-financial channel and financial channel. Among the non-financial channel, there are things like, ability correlations, role model effects, and so on and so forth. I think, anybody working on education are very familiar with those. It is the more educated parent can sort into neighborhoods with better school quality, and that makes geographic location a determinant of this correlated association as well. Non-financial, so these are basically non-financial channels. Among the financial channel, anything that affects parents' investment decision is going to be relevant. For example, returns to education in the labor market would be important, and that return might in turn be affected by many policies, from taxes, tariffs, to infrastructure investment, all kinds of things. Parents' altruism is going to be relevant, and that altruism may be shaped by social, cultural, and religious norms. Parental investment will also depend on school, both availability and quality of school, which in turn are determined by, going to be influenced by public investment and policies. I should mention that parental investment could be complementary or substitute to public investment in school. For example, if a school is constructed in a village, that might allow parents not to home school the kids, and in this case, it is going to be substitute. On the other hand, having a better teacher might induce parents to spend more money on books. That in that case, it's going to be complementary. So before I go into the next slide, I want to mention one more source of complementarity here, which I'm going to call Bakerian complementarity, because Baker and his co-authors emphasize this very much. And that complementarity comes from the fact that educated parents may be able to get higher returns to their investment as well, because they can make better decisions. They can, home tutor their kids and so on, do supplementary tutoring and so on and so forth. Okay, so I am summarizing all of this in one equation, which is the education production function. And you can see that it has 3 different parts. The investment part, the interaction is actually capturing the Bakerian complementarity, and the non-financial part, which would be like role model effects. The returns to investment also depends on school quality, Q, and also parental response to school quality, which are mu's. So I'm just gonna leave it there and then say, when we do the optimization under self-financing constraint, we get 2 2 equations, one for investment, one for kids' education as a function of parents' education. Okay, and the bottom equation here actually is giving you the specification of the intergenerational regression equation. Okay, and first thing to note here that this is not linear. this is nonlinear. For example, this will become convex if Vicarian complementarity is important, concave if that's not important, basically. Okay, so it's in a way, this is more of an empirical question, whether it is linear or non-linear. So I am going to start giving you some evidence, okay? And this is also going to give you the answer to the first question that I posed in the outline, okay? So this is, let me explain what we do here. We took China family panel survey data for 2016 and estimated this regression with a residual term, okay? And plotted the predicted value for that regression. So on the horizontal axis, and in all graphs in this presentation on the horizontal axis, we will have father's education. On the vertical axis, different things. In this case, it's predicted children's schooling. What you can see from here that for daughters, and this is the urban sample, for daughters, the regression equation is actually linear. But for sons, it is non-linear, it is convex, which in a way telling us that this Vicarian complementarity is important in the case of son in urban China. Now, next, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to try to find the slope of this line. Remember that slope of this line is going to give you the estimate of relative mobility. And, lower value of that estimate is better because it shows higher mobility, and higher value shows higher persistence. So the solid lines gives the, so here on the vertical axis, basically, I am giving the slope estimates for different level of father's education. The solid lines corresponds to the graphs that you had seen before. The dotted line is when I impose the linearity condition in son's sample. What it is saying is this: if we compare the the horizontal lines, we would conclude that persistence is a bit higher for girls than boys, okay? But when we allow nonlinearity for the son sample, what we see on the left-hand side is that for children coming from relatively uneducated families, mobility is very, very high. Actually, these mobility estimates are similar to the mobility estimates that you see in the context of Scandinavian countries. On the other tail of father's education, persistence is also very high, as a result of which persistence for boys' persistence in this case is higher than girls' persistence. And this is a very interesting story that we miss when we actually impose that linearity assumption on in estimating intergenerational mobility. Okay. So this kind of answers my first question, and you're going to see these two graphs many times, and I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll be more than convinced that this relationship is not going to be linear always. It's probably going to be mostly non-linear, okay? With that, let me now I have the conceptual framework in place. Let me try to tackle the question of what would happen if we improve school quality in Indonesia. So Indonesia data is coming from the Indonesia Family Life Survey. We used IFLS 2014 data. Basically, the sample are the adult children sample. The advantage of this data is that it also collected information on cognitive abilities. So in all regressions, we can control for cognitive abilities. Let's start again with the estimation of the intergenerational mobility regression. Again, I am on the left-hand side, and here I'm making distinction between rural and urban areas. On the left-hand side, I have the predicted children's schooling for different level of father schooling. And on the right-hand side, I have the estimates of relative immobility or persistence, okay? Okay, And the picture here is similar to China. What you can see, that relationship actually is convex in rural areas, not in urban areas. And as a result, we see that again for children coming from less educated families, mobility is quite high for children coming in rural areas, and children coming from more educated families, persistence is much higher in rural areas than urban areas. So this is so far so good. Usually, literature stops right here, but we want to know what goes behind this pattern that we observe here. And for that, I have to go back to the model and try and estimate other aspects of the model. And the very first thing that I will start with is basically the investment equation. So this here, I ran this regression again with a residual term in there and plotted the predicted values against father's years of education. And the conclusion from this graph is probably, looks very reasonable to me, which is that on average, urban areas, parents in urban areas spend a lot more money on kids' education, and parents' expenditure on kids' education increases with parents' education too. Okay. I am going to skip some of the other steps right now in the interest of time, but basically what I'm going to tell you here is that the thing that we're trying to do here is getting all this reduced from estimation and then trying to trace them back to the structural parameter of the education production function. Once we recover those, we do two things. First, we check, remember that the IGRE is linear in the case of urban areas. So we first check whether Beckerian external complementarity is important there. And we do find that it is actually important in both rural and urban areas, more important in rural areas. And if I remind you what this Beckerian complementarity is, that this just saying that more educated parents are more efficient in making the investment decisions. Okay. The second thing we do is we look for the indicator of school quality, and we use teacher-pupil ratio as an indicator. In urban area, teacher-pupil ratio is about 20% higher than rural areas, and we use that information to trace back the parental response function. With that, we now can tell whether parental investment is complementary or substitute to school input. And for that, we have to find out how the marginal returns to investment varies with respect to school inputs, which is Q here. So in this graph, I plotted the value of this expression on the left-hand side here and drew the curves for rural and urban areas. Main conclusion from here of what you can see is that both the curves in the positive quadrant, which means that parental investment is complementary to public investment in this case. And the other thing to note is that the strength of this complementarity is, at least to me, surprisingly higher in rural areas than urban areas, and higher, not surprisingly, for more educated households, more educated parents. Okay, with this, what we had done is that we did this policy counterfactual where we improved school quality Q by 10% in both rural and urban areas. And from this complementarity graph, you can already tell that it's going to increase investment by parents and increase investment by educated parents even more. Here, the ultimate outcome on the predicted years of schooling for kids. And here you can see that both in urban and rural areas, the curves are shifting upward and also rotating upward. What it means that on average, the intervention will improve absolute mobility of all kids, regardless of father's education. But the gain in education is going to be bigger for kids whose parents are more educated. In other words, it's also going to decrease relative mobility or increase persistence. So my policy conclusion here would be that, we probably need to look for more targeted intervention rather than going for this blanket policy of improving school quality everywhere. If we are to, consider its impact on relative mobility as well. Parental investment and school inputs are not always complementary. So we looked at, in a separate paper, we looked at the school construction under the INPRESS program. This is very well studied topic in Indonesia, and from existing literature, we already know that it improves absolute mobility. Our initial analysis shows that it actually improves relative mobility for the boys, but we have not seen much of an impact on the mobility of girls. So with that, in this case, actually, parental input and school inputs are substitute, not complementary. Okay, with that, I am now going to move into my third and final question, which is to look at the gender bias and intergenerational educational mobility in India. I guess the gender bias, existence of gender bias in India is well documented. But in that, gloomy picture, maybe there is a bright spot in education. Here we took data from India Human Development Survey, and we, estimated the average education attainment of boys and girls, both urban and rural areas, and the shaded area, and for different birth cohorts. And shaded area here shows you the difference between boys and girls. And in both rural and urban cases, what you see is that the gender differences in education has narrowed quite a bit. In fact, in the case of urban areas, it more or less disappeared by the 1990s cohort. From this, you may actually think that mobility is better, maybe mobility is better for girls in urban areas, particularly. So I ran those linear regressions, and here you see the slope coefficients. And what you see is that, in fact, the slope coefficient implies that persistence is actually higher for girls than boys, and there is practically no difference between rural and urban areas. So how do we reconcile this fact that there is gender bias against girls, there is higher persistence among girls, and yet we see this convergence in education, particularly in urban areas? Again, to answer this question, we go back to the model, and we consider three sources of gender bias in three spheres of a girl's life: family. Parents may invest less in girls' education because they might underestimate the ability of girl. Actually, I myself had heard many times from parents that when the girl is doing well in school, it's because she is very organized and hardworking. And when a boy is doing well in school, it's because he is genius. Okay. Parents may also invest less simply because of son preference, in which case they are putting a lot less welfare weight to girls' welfare than boys' welfare. Another sphere where girls face biases is probably in school. You may have seen this Adukia paper in India, where she found that girls drop out of school when they reach puberty because of lack of toilets. Finally, women's returns to women's education in labor market may be lower than men, but evidence here is quite the opposite. Actually, there's quite a bit of literature on this, and they find that women's returns to education is higher than men in the labor market. Okay. with this, before even we go into the empirical work, the model delivers an interesting result, which is that if the education production function is constant returns to scale, then in that case, we get a linear intergenerational regression equation too. In that case, any bias, financial bias against girls would not be reflected in the slope parameters. In other words, it's not gonna affect intergenerational persistence. But by now, we all know that these regressions may not be linear. And to check that, we start with this, again, the same graph that you have seen, and by now you already know how to interpret it. But in this case, we find that all four curves are concave. In other words, the Bakerian complementarity may not be that important in the case of India. The other thing to note here is that this absolute convergence between boys and girls in terms of schooling for children born to fathers with college education, okay? And this is in urban areas. So that's very similar to the very first graph that I had shown you. Okay, now let's move to the relative mobility. Here, actually, all the curves are downward sloping, and I want to, and the shaded areas are actually 95% confidence interval. I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. First of all, look at the less educated parents. The persistence is very, very high for these kids, not just in urban areas, but in rural areas too. And these estimates are some of the highest estimates that I had seen for developing countries. So India certainly is not doing something right, something that it seems China or Indonesia had gotten right. The second thing to note here is that persistence tend to be higher for girls than boys, but we do see this convergence in persistence for girls born to more educated parents. And that is actually, so for urban areas, we saw the convergence in absolute mobility and relative mobility. Now let's see what happens to investment. Now, when we come to investment, here you can see very clearly that there is gender bias against girls. And in fact, in this case, college-educated parents are not immune to this bias, unfortunately. So how do we reconcile this? That, we see this bias in investment, but we do also see the convergence when parents are more educated, particularly in urban areas. Again, we trace back to structural parameters and so on and so forth, on the basis of which we can say there are two reasons for this. First of all, that parents' non-financial effect is much, much stronger for girls than boys, to the extent that it actually offsets the biases that you see in financial investment. Okay? And this is not surprising. In traditional society, like India, girls' physical mobility outside the house is limited, which means also that she has limited set of role models, and parents actually play a very outsized role in the girls' outcomes. And this is something we had seen in an earlier paper in the context of occupational mobility as well. Okay, so this is one of the reasons. The second reason is a bit grim, which is that the sex-selective abortion was adopted by our educated urban households much earlier than anybody else, and it is more prevalent in those households still, which means that in the urban sample, in that part of parents' education distribution, the girls that we are seeing are mostly wanted girls. We don't see so many unwanted girls. And because of that, we also see this convergence. In fact, the youngest in our sample is born in 1994. And, sex-selective abortion became a lot more common in rural areas much later, in around 2000 and onward. And so in rural sample, actually, the estimates are consistent with strong son preference too. We also find that the school environment tends to be unfavorable to girls in both rural and in urban areas. And we repeated the analysis for patrilineal and matrilineal states. And as you may have already expected in matrilineal states, we don't see much of a gender difference in investment or in intergenerational mobility as well. So I think, my only silver line that I see here is that even in patrilineal societies, if a girl is born to a highly educated parent, she fares as well as a boy born in the same family. And this is not because financial investment is not biased against her. It is simply because parents, non-financial effect is much bigger. And maybe, these girls do learn some useful life skill in terms of organization and hard work and so on from the parents. Okay, so that's basically the main presentation. If I have time, I can go over, very briefly tell you what the conclusions are, but it's already clear to you. Dion, do I have a bit of time?
Take 1 minute to just recap with a slide.
Basically, recapping, if we are to do better work on this area, we need better data. Second thing is that we also, there is no reason to believe that these relationships are linear. Relative persistence may vary across fathers' distribution of fathers or parents' education. And third takeaway would be that when we are doing education policies, we do try to see what the possible impact on that would be on child outcome, but maybe we should also pay a bit more attention to, the impact on the child outcome of where the child is coming from relatively poorer background. Social norms are important. We know that, the gender bias that we see in patrilineal states in India are rooted in the social, cultural, and religious norms, but at least in this case, we see that, parental education can counter that gender bias to some extent. And with that, I am going to stop. Thank you, everybody. And I'm really looking forward to the questions.
Thanks, Forhad. Really fascinating. So next we're going to turn to Halsey. And then after Halsey's, we may give Forhad just a couple of minutes in case there's some specific things she'd like to come back to. But then I'll turn it to the Q&A from the audience. I see there's already a few questions in the chat. So either post your question or you can just flag to me that you have a question and I'll actually call on you to please ask that question out loud when it comes time to the open session. But first, let's turn it over to Halsey.
Great, thank you, Dion, and thanks to Forhad for this very useful quick tour of a lot of key issues in intergenerational educational mobility. I'd like to start my comments with a quick recap, because I hope that'll be useful to other people who, like me, are not experts on these measurement issues, and Forhad covered a lot of important results very quickly. So just to recap, so the first half was on measurement and conceptual issues. So starting out with measurement, Forhad showed that if you have truncation of a sample due to relocation of children, that's a real problem for measurement, and it biases the estimates of mobility because of differential relocation depending on education level. So she showed us good empirical evidence that this makes a very big difference in the estimates of mobility in a couple of cases for which we do have more complete data, India and Bangladesh. So that's quite useful to keep in mind. Then she offered us a nice comprehensive conceptual framework on the different drivers of educational mobility and persistence, and use that to show that the relationship between the parents and child's education can be nonlinear, and that this has important implications for the degree of relative mobility at different points in the distribution. So then she took it and she used those frameworks and measurement approaches, and she applied them in a couple of cases. First, we had an application of this framework on analysis of complementarities and intergenerational educational mobility, focusing on these rural-urban comparisons in Indonesia. And this section is really motivated by trying to understand whether better school inputs can help reduce intergenerational persistence. And I'll come back to that one in the rest of my remarks. That's what I want to key on. But then finally, we heard an analysis of how gender bias affects intergenerational mobility in India, and whether or not it explains the higher persistence for girls. And I think she showed us a kind of a mixture of good and bad news from a mobility perspective. So in urban areas for girls with the most educated fathers, you see a convergence of predicted education with their brothers, which kind of implies that if we were able to improve education more broadly for more households, you could get some convergence, but we don't see that in the rural areas. And then we see for both the urban and rural areas, you see these large absolute differences in household education expenditure in the more educated households. So there are forces through which the social norms are still working to inhibit mobility and mobility of girls. Let me now turn to, I want to focus in on the results from Indonesia on complementarities and mobility, and specifically on these mobility impacts of investing in school quality. And Forhad explained to you they were testing this idea from Becker et al. And noted that the equity and efficiency implications of public education depend critically on the nature of the interactions, whether it's complementarity or substitutability, between public investment and parental investments. So specifically, the question is, what is the impact on intergenerational mobility of improving school quality? Now, for the banks working in education, knowing the answer to this question seems central to me. So I was very interested to read this. I mean, obviously a major thrust of our work in education over the past couple of decades in particular has been to increase the quality of school education for all children. First by getting and keeping them in school, of course, but also by focusing much more on improving quality, and especially for the most disadvantaged children who have failed the most by poor quality service delivery. We saw this in the WDR 2004 on service delivery, and our Learning for All education strategy in the WDR 2018, taking different aspects of this problem on learning. And so all of them are targeting better schooling quality and better learning outcomes. And obviously we have good evidence that this will pay off for the economy as a whole, and in an absolute sense for individuals. There are substantial individual returns, whatever the SES or the gender of the student, and also positive impacts on non-economic outcomes like health and the quality of service delivery and governance. But we do need to understand also if this emphasis on getting high quality opportunities to children will also improve relative social mobility, intergenerational mobility, because if instead they reinforce inequalities, obviously that reduces both the opportunities for individuals and the long run growth and dynamism of the economy. So what do Forhad and her co-authors find? They find that in Indonesia, at least, improvement in school quality improves educational outcomes for the entire distribution of fathers' education, but it decreases relative mobility because of this complementarity that's leading to greater increases in education for children of the more educated parents, and thereby it increases inequality for the next generation. So this is an important result, and I think assuming the result holds up, whether in Indonesia or in other settings, and Forhad mentioned a counterexample that's useful to think about with school construction, we really need to think about the policy implications and what this implies for all of our interventions to improve school quality. Before I turn to that, let me just mention one empirical issue that I think relates to this, which is how to think about the measurement of school quality. So thanks to Forhad actually for useful discussion yesterday on this whole thing, including this, which is in the paper they use pupil-teacher ratios as a measure for parameterizing this difference in school quality, say across rural and urban. And that's a common one to use. Another is something like teacher salaries. But we know these are highly imperfect, very input-based measures of quality. And we can take the example of Indonesia. It's a country that has had low pupil-teacher ratios in comparative perspective for a long time. It instituted very substantial increases in teacher salary over the last 15 years. And yet it's a country that has had flat PISA scores. It has, when you look at the skills of adults, you find no improvement in kind of foundational skills across the generations. It's good work by Beatty and Pritchett show. So clearly those aren't great measures by themselves. And so often to get around this, we go straight to learning outcomes as a measure of school quality. But obviously that's problematic in this setting where Forhad's looking at the various different influences on learning outcomes and in effect, I'm actually on educational outcomes, but learning will be part of that, which include the household factors. So we can't just look at that. So probably we're best off combining a variety of measures of the actual quality of the teaching and learning experience. And so it's much more than pupil-teacher ratios. We've made a lot of advances recently on that. For example, one I thought of is the TEACH tool, which allows systematic observation of teacher quality in the classroom. We're starting to get standardized measures of that from across quite a few countries, thanks to my colleagues in the global practice. We have the service delivery indicators that gives us a number of different indicators. We have the Global Education Policy Dashboard Initiative, which does the same. So it will be important as we think about measuring school quality in this context to really measure what matters. But let me turn to the main point, which is really about the policy implications of Forhad et al.'s conclusions for promoting school quality, both in what I think of as normal times and in COVID times, which seem to be becoming normal, but let's assume they're different. So in normal times, when we think about the result about how public investments in school quality reduce mobility, I think we should ask which public investments or public investments in school quality for whom. And Forhad did mention this idea that this result suggests we should be targeting toward more disadvantaged students and households. This is really a crucial point because here in the basic setup in this paper, the school quality is assumed to change uniformly for all students if you improve school quality. But of course, from a policy perspective, this isn't inevitable, and we can direct our resources to the most disadvantaged, who are measured here as those with the least educated parents, but more generally, anybody who's being hurt by failures in service delivery and that are reinforced by the kind of complementarities that Forhad is examining. So how do we do that? I mean, that is a major thrust of our policy at the bank. Sort of on the supply side, you think about financing that's directed to the levels of education in the schools that serve the most disadvantaged children, whether by trying to get more resources to primary schools or using formula-based allocations that target the most disadvantaged schools. You can also do it through better teacher recruitment and rotation policies to get the more effective teachers to the rural, remote areas, school meal programs, et cetera. And then there are demand-side investments to ensure that the disadvantaged are going to be able to benefit from school quality when you do invest in it, so CCTs and scholarships. I think, so that's kind of on the policy side. This should also influence how we think about the metrics for success in education. So if we just look at, say, average learning levels or average levels of education in society, we're not prioritizing the most disadvantaged. Some of the measures we've come out with more recently, summary measures, actually, I think, help with this. I mean, both the learning adjusted years of schooling and the learning poverty metrics. They both kind of, in one way or another, put the thumb on the scale for equity, one of them more overtly than others. So learning adjusted years of schooling has some advantage for the more disadvantaged in the sense because it tops out at 14 years. That's the maximum you can get on that scale. So it doesn't help to add more years of education in tertiary for the elite. Much more directly, we have the learning poverty metric, which we now target, that focuses on the number of children with foundational literacy skills, the share who can read with comprehension at age 10 or the end of primary school. And if you target that, that will help us direct our efforts toward disproportionately supporting the children from the least educated families and the ones who most need and thereby supporting the relative mobility of that group. Finally, let me just say policy implications in COVID times. We have all the more reason now not to let the quality of schooling sort of differentially affect children from less educated households. And obviously, what we've seen from COVID, it's really been a blow to long-term mobility. We thought that anyway, but it's clearly even more so given these results and complementarities. We've been assembling a lot of the learning loss evidence, and we find during COVID, we find substantial overall impacts, of course, in ways that you have a lost generation. But it also shows widening gaps. As schooling went remote, as you all know, school quality during remote learning became differentially worse for the most disadvantaged students because of connection issues, for example, and they don't have parents who can make up for it. So to think about those complementarities. And then as they come back, those students risk falling further behind, as results from Jishnu and co-authors show from Pakistan. So to prevent a decline in mobility and increase in inequality, we really need to focus on that. We can focus on it by mitigating the disequalizing effects of remote learning, for example, building up the resilience of the system so it reaches more children, so that when you do have to go remote, you're not leaving out half or 2/3 or 3/4 of the population. Once they're back in school, we can direct school resources toward the schools whose student populations are hardest hit with targeted financing. We can support investments in low-income parents' ability to support their children. For example, we have a Read at Home initiative, which gives books and support to parents, so that particularly less educated parents, so they can help their children with foundational reading. And finally, to focus the curriculum on the foundational skills, because those with parents who have less education won't have been able to acquire those as well. When you focus on that, it's really disproportionately helping the most disadvantaged children. So these were all priorities already, and they would be even if you just had additive effects of school quality and parental education. But I think they're even more crucial now with the kinds of complementarities that Forhad showed us, because we have a risk of a lost generation, but it's a generation which some are losing much more than others. So we need to direct public investments to prevent the decline in mobility that will result. So that's a lot. So let me close there so we have time to hear from our other colleagues. And thanks again to Forhad and our co-authors.
Thanks, Halsey, for that, for both sort of reflecting on the presentation itself and making these linkages to sort of both general policy and the GP, but also kind of in COVID times, which I think we're all thinking about. Forhad, do you want to respond with just 1 or 2 minutes, or would you rather we just go straight to the Q&A? There's already a few queued up, so what do you think?
I can respond in 2 minutes because there is not much to disagree.
Go ahead.
I mean, the policy side, I agree completely. I think, we do need to pay special attention to kids coming from disadvantaged households. Anytime, you involve parents in kids' education, parents with better education will always have a leg up, right? The kids will always benefit a bit better. So you kind of think of all types of policies that can counteract that effect. And I am very happy to know that, we are already doing all of this in different ways. I think one of the questions that Jose raised about the measurement of school quality, I have to agree. The thing is that some of these surveys, for example, service delivery survey or teaching tools and so on, these are giving you information for recent years, right? We are almost certain that we're not going to get it for this. Our age cohort is mid-70s to late 90s. for that age cohort. So it's not totally going to solve that problem, but I take your point, and we will try many different ways to, check out the sensitivity of the results, because, simulation results depend so much on this. So, and that's basically my response.
Thanks, Forhad. Let's open it up. I mean, we have a couple of, some questions that were coming through the talk, which are clarification questions, but then some of those same people elaborated. So I'll turn to the people who posed those questions, and maybe they can focus on the ones that they think now kind of need more clarification. So first we have Ahmad Hassan, and then I'll turn afterwards to Dr. Renu Yadav. And then we have a question after that came in from YouTube that I will ask on behalf of the YouTubers. So Mr. Hassan, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Yes, I'm a former World Banker. I worked in East Asia for about 7-8 years in my last, and I'm also formerly a teacher of Forhad Shilpi. So that's another introduction. First of all, very interesting presentation. One of the questions that I had was, so you use father's education all the time and not mother's education. I take it that the father's education is more or less it fully identifies the parent's education position. So I accept that. But let me just point out, one of the points that I make after working for several years in East Asia and going back and working on Bangladesh, looking at the situation here, a big difference, a driver between development outcomes is the labor force participation ratio of females. Right? So East Asia has, including Indonesia, a much higher female labor force participation ratio. Bangladesh does better, but most of South Asia is pretty behind. So my question is, the girls' education, how much is this tied to mothers working? One question. I mean, can we sort of address this question? The other is, again, girls' education and investment in girls' education may be partly tied to the opportunities. What kind of opportunities are there in the economy and society for girls to get returns from their education? If parents do not see those opportunities, they will accordingly invest less. So just and here my guess is, and again going back to a famous, I think, an insight of Professor Yunus of Grameen Bank, that investment in mothers and women are particularly important because the whole household gets, you will invested in through the mother. So what is the role of the mother's education? What is the role of mother's labor force participation rate? And my other question is in general, the relative mobility is of course important. No question, it's important. But the big question is absolute mobility. I mean, we don't have enough education of our school children, number one, and the quality issue. That's a very big issue. I'm not going to go into that. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thanks. I just, taking privileged role of the chair. I also was wondering about this mothers versus fathers, and was remembering back the old Duncan Thomas paper. What was it, like fathers like sons, like mothers like daughters? And was wondering whether there is some differentiation somehow. I'm curious to hear what your thought on that. Next, let's turn it to Dr. Renu Yadav, who had a couple of questions.
Thank you so much, Filmer. And it's a wonderful presentation, Dr. Shilpi. It was really, because as I'm from India, so it was interesting to hear the comparative studies of India and Bangladesh, and a few interesting findings from India. So my question is, like, some are clarification kind and some on the basis of your research, what you can suggest. So clarification is, for you use the word non-resident and co-resident in your one of the graph where you was telling about how this is impacting the girls' education. So I want to know from you, what is this? And another thing which I really want to ask, that you have talked about the school education, that how the facilities, especially for menstruation or hygiene, how much facilities are available. Do you have any idea regarding that how persistence of girls in STEM education can be promoted on the basis of your research. So if you can highlight this, then it will be great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Then Forhad, I'm going to ask one more question that's transmitted from YouTube from Diego Luna Bazaldua. So he asks, to what extent the existence of additional policies, e.g. affirmative action, that promote school access to girls and minority students can accelerate social mobility? So I guess it's a version of that targeted policy question that both you and Halsey were alluding to, but this is very much from the affirmative action lens. So 3 sets of questions. Over to you, Forhad.
Okay, thank you very much. Very relevant question. Mother's education, that is a question that I was expecting. So, because that's something that has always interested me too. And in one of the earlier paper, we did look at the mother versus father's education. The evidence throughout the world is that a lot of the intergenerational link between parents and children run along the gender line. So father's education is important for boys, mother's education is a lot more important for girls. That is both in developed countries and in developing countries. So that's the reason we focused on father's education is this. A lot of the time, the survey responses for mother's education are not there. So you lose sample. And sometimes people can't, if it is a little bit older data, people can't even tell how many years of education mother had. And I have had, practical experience on this in the field. So that's one reason. The other reason is that I had been working on this for long enough that in some of the recent work, which I did not talk about today, we looked at, how much of the, for example, you can summarize the impact of family, community, schools, everything in terms of sibling correlations, right? And we did estimate this sibling correlation for a large number of countries and tried to figure out what % of that sibling correlation can be explained by father's education. And if I tell you the, some of the initial results that we are finding there is that for developing countries, this is 80 to 90% of the variation. Incredible. That tells me that this associative matching in marriage market is very effective in correlating mother's education and father's education very much. So that's another reason. But overall, we would explore some of these things along the gender line and so on and so forth when we have good enough data on this. On the labor force participation, again, the paper that I mentioned right now about this gender line influence, we had actually done a paper on this, on labor force participation of girls, how that correlates with mothers' labor force participation. Again, this was the work that we had done on Nepal and Vietnam. And we did find very strong correlation. I mean, those are like, really, really strong correlation between girls and the mother. So there is no, I talked about the, non-financial channel of effects. And I do think that is very, very important along the gender line. Mother has really big influence on, children's absolute and relative mobility both. So I agree with that. It's just that, not enough data available to do that sort of work. There was one absolute mobility and school quality issue. So this is one disclaimer here is that the work that we had done so far looked only on the schooling, years of schooling. we can't say anything about school quality. And the simple reason is, even if you look at the PISA scores and other things, the other measures of school quality, these are available only probably for children's generation. We can't tell it what happened in the parents' generation. And without that data, it's not possible to push along this line. But again, this would be an interesting thing to do. Okay. Now coming to resident versus co-resident. So I think I'm going to give you an example from South Asia, which is that if a girl is married, they tend to leave house. So if you are doing a household survey, you are going to miss that girl. And that child is going to be non-resident in this case. On the other hand, parents tend to live with a son, and that son is going to be the co-resident. So that's the distinction here. Okay, on the STEM education, again, I have not done research on this myself, but I had kept up with the research. I have to tell you that in terms of girls' STEM education, India is actually doing much better than many developed countries. Okay, and this is despite all the gender biases and so on and so forth that we talk about. That is a very different issue, and I actually don't know again, how to relate, how to get the data to find this out. But I would suspect that the correlation between children and parents in STEM education is going to be very strong. So that's my prior in this case. And first, the last question was on affirmative action. Yes, I would expect that affirmative action would help with improving the intergenerational mobility. One of the things that I looked at that from my readings of literature, you can think of early childhood programs which targets the disadvantaged families. This could be one type of affirmative action for which we do have some evidence. In general, they are very useful in increasing intergenerational mobility. But one of the problems that's been found, and this is all in the context of Europe, is that a lot of the time, the families who would benefit most from these programs, they don't even sign up for these services. So that's, that's kind of another round of problems that we will have to deal with. I mean, there has to be some way to also to increase the participation of disadvantaged families into this affirmative action types programs. So with that, I can take the next round of questions.
Sure, we have one that's coming from YouTube from Kevin Michael Callahan Sr., which is, school quality certainly complements parental investments, although you've shed some doubt on that, but school quality certainly complements parental investments. So how do the school construction data briefly mentioned impact the studies in policy today? So I guess it's part of that discussion you were having with Halsey about, the complementarities at the past and then looking forward. And that's the only one we have right now. So why don't you go for that one?
Okay, so yes, again, not every policy intervention that you're doing to improve school quality is not going to be complementary to, parental investment is not going to be complementary to do that. You could, think of policies to target especially disadvantaged kids. And my favorite example in this case is compulsory education. Compulsory education does not necessarily affect the right tail of parents' distribution that much because those kids were going to school anyway, right? Compulsory education tends to bring in kids who are from the disadvantaged background. and who would have dropped out of school and things like that. So that kind of policies can help. And once you have, and the China-Indonesia results, I suspect that some of it is because of, particularly for the rural areas, is because of policies like that. The other question was about school construction. I guess, school construction can be complementary or substitute. It's a matter of, which effect dominates. So school construction means that you don't really have to, on the one hand, maybe if your village did not have school, you were sending the school far away. Sending the kids far away school. So in other words, you were investing in transport and, if they had to be in boarding school, the boarding and so on and so forth. Once the school comes into the village, what happens is that you don't have to spend that money anymore, right? You can just send a kid to the neighborhood school. So that way it is substitute. On the other hand, it is possible that, on the top of my head, you can actually think of a scenario, it can be complement too, right? Bringing in school in a village might actually increase the, competition. Maybe you had only private school before, now you have a public school, you can bring in the kids there, or the other way, okay? Either way, it could happen. So it can be complementary or substitute. Again, the question is which effect predominates. And I think at least the initial finding from Indonesia tend to tell me that it is complementary, because the school construction also happened in much remoter villages and where you don't have many other options. So I don't know if I answered it okay or not.
I think you did. Thanks.
Okay.
I guess we have a couple minutes. I have one question, since we don't have another question in the chat. Just something that, as you were talking, and this goes back to the complementarity question. I was curious. You said in the one example that complementarity was higher in the rural areas, but it was increasing in education. And just, obviously the slides were going through quickly, but I was like, wait a second, that sort of seems inconsistent somehow, because the characteristics of the rural areas seem to be, I know those are geographic characteristics, but
Yes.
they seem inconsistent with the higher education, which, have you thought about that? Is there an explanation for that?
Yes. Okay. We did think about it, and this is an issue that actually Jose raised yesterday too. So I mean, in a way, the complementarity the complementarity that we are thinking about here is not, the role model effect or home tutoring. That is not the complementarity. This is the investment complementarity, right? So basically, if your school quality is bad, you might think that, parents spend more, parents are discouraged, don't spend as much money on, okay, maybe I am talking exactly opposite of what I am trying to say, but basically two things happening. One is that with income, so the graph that I had shown you was different for rural and urban areas. In each of those areas, with increase in parents' education, the strength of complementarity increasing, right? So that was, but rural area was always above the urban. So I think the basic question is why we do tend to see higher complementarities in rural areas, not so much than urban areas. Complementarity is present in both, right? And the reason being is that maybe some of it, I have to relate back to my experience from Bangladesh, is that in the rural areas is the educated parents who would probably invest in private tutor. Whereas in urban areas, everybody had private tutor. Actually, there was a joke that, people in slum spend a lot more money on private tutoring than, richer people in Bangladesh. So because of this difference, if you think of this gradient, that is one of the hunch that I have, that's we are seeing this higher complementarity in the rural areas. The other hunch is that on average, parents in urban areas are more educated than rural areas, and the variation of parental education in rural areas much higher. And there are a lot fewer high educated parents in rural areas, and that may be another factor which is getting into this. So those are my two hunches. I cannot tell why we are seeing it, but our expectation was that we would see the opposite. So
No, that's fine. I mean, and actually, the fact that research leads to more questions,
right.
is a feature of research, not a bug. So we have two more questions. So Fatim Diabagate, we are running out of time, so I will ask you to ask your question very quickly if you can. Fatim?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Forhad. I found this presentation very interesting, especially because it answers some question I had as a part of a project I'm working on. In Tonga, I've worked on household data in Tonga, and we've noticed that girls' learning outcomes are generally higher than boys' learning outcomes. And as you were presenting, you mentioned something about, I'm not sure, maybe I haven't well understood, but you said that most of the time when girls perform well, it's because like they are well organized, while boys, they are genius. You'll correct me if I haven't understood well, but I don't know if this is a result of your research or another research. I just need reference to sites as part of this project, and maybe you can help me on that one. Thank you.
I think I can answer. I think she was joking and she was trying to portray a stereotype, but I'll turn it back to Forhad.
Okay.
Just very briefly, we
Okay,
have another
thank you.
question from YouTube from Liliana Serrate Mendia. She says that you mentioned a book that didn't seem to appear on the slide, so she's wondering if you could
Okay.
let us know what that book was, and also any information to Latin American countries. So, so you have 1 minute to maybe just give very brief responses to those.
Okay. I think first one, I mean, Dion already answered, but there are some sociological studies, I can dig it up and give you the reference. That is the standard way people talk about boys and girls in developing countries. On the second question was actually, sorry,
Just the book. You mentioned a book.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah, okay. The book, the title of the book is The Sun Also Rises. Okay. And you do Google search, you're gonna find it.
I think you'll find another book first.
No, the spelling of sun is different. So this is S-O-N and the other one was S-U-N. So
Okay. And then any references to Latin American studies along similar lines?
Okay. So the Latin American study, the reference is actually is a JDE paper that came, I think, 2018, and it's in the literature slide that I put in. So it is already there. I think it's near is the reference.
And just so everybody knows, after these talks, we usually put the video up on a dedicated web page. We also put the slides. So everybody who was invited, or I think everybody who accepted the invitation, oh, there it is already. At that website, we will put the slides and we'll put the video. And thank you everybody for coming. Halsey, unless you want to jump in with any last words, I think we should probably give this a close, but you're okay? Okay, thanks Forhad, thanks Halsey.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for participating, for the great discussion and questions and the excellent presentation, Forhad. You gave us lots of information and food for thought, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Brad. Thanks, John.
Bye.